Good evening. I'm Beth Meyer, one of the co-directors of the Center for Cultural Landscapes, and we have a double introduction tonight. Jessica Sewell, the other co-director, will be introducing Andrea Roberts, our speaker. But I wanted to say a word or two about the endowment that funds this lecture. The Sarah Schallenberger Brown Cultural Landscape and Sites Initiative was endowed by Carrie Brown. Carrie is an alum of the College of Arts and Sciences who has a very good friend who has a very prominent landscape architecture practice in Charlottesville. You might know who that is. And in 2009, 2010, after meeting with Kim Tanzer, who is then our dean, and understanding the cross-disciplinary work happening related to cultural landscapes, Carrie decided to endow this initiative to fund fellowships, roundtables, lectures, and symposia that were related to cultural landscapes. And over the last 3 or 4 years, since I was the dean and then we created the center, we've been funding monthly roundtables that are informal sessions on topics like critical ecology and digital technologies. We've hosted talks, curated Decay by Caitlin DeSilve, and the Central Park Memoir by Elizabeth Barlow Rogers, and perhaps most notably ran our first symposium on race, public space, and commemoration in spring of 2017, where Mabel Wilson and Del Upton, among others, were gathered. We'll be following up with a second symposium in September on cultural landscape atlases, and we actually hope we might be able to get Andrea back for that. So a word or two about really the remarkable Sarah Schallenberger Brown, whose memory is honored by her granddaughter's gift. She was a renowned philanthropist and activist for both historic preservation and environmental conservation causes across many scales. She attended Sweetbriar College and graduated in 1932, and then resided in Louisville, Kentucky for 75 years, where she and her husband, W.L. Lyons Brown, raised 4 children, and she has children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who've gone to UVA. Her lifelong interest in the arts and in conservation, the curation of natural and historic sites, was accompanied by extraordinary generosity. She contributed to causes local in Kentucky, as well as those of import nationally and globally. She contributed her intellect, political support, and financial backing to land acquisition for parks in and around Louisville, to the designation of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. That's a story we need to know more about, and funded research that supported the Kyoto Protocols. Over her lifetime, she supported the Audubon Society, the American Farmland Trust, the Nature Conservancy, Woods Hole, the World Wildlife Fund, and the Louisville Waterfront Park that was designed and planned by George Hargraves and Associates. The scope of her concerns and passions maps squarely onto the aspirations of our school and the Cultural Landscape and Sites Initiative that ranges from research, interpretation, preservation, planning, and the design of sites that are full of both history and nature, memories and living systems, contested narratives, and disturbed ecosystems. I didn't have the pleasure of meeting her, but I've gotten to know Carrie quite well. She's out of town. She lives in Charlottesville, but out of town this month. And she wanted to send her regards, her thanks to Andrea for being here. And it's with that first introduction. I'll pass the baton to Jessica, who will introduce our speaker.
Hi. So I'm Jessica Sewell, and I'm co-director of the Center for Cultural Landscapes, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Andrea Roberts to you this evening. I'm also going to do a little plug here right at the beginning. We also have a roundtable, more informal roundtable with Andrea tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. From 11 to 1 in 220C, so just one flight up. Everyone is welcome. There will be snacks. And this is an opportunity to have a conversation and learn more about Andrea's use of digital technologies as a tool for teaching, as a tool for outreach, and as a tool for research and communication. All right, so Andrea Roberts is a really important voice for intersectional and socially grounded preservation, history, and planning. I think she's a particularly wonderful person to bring here because she goes across the different disciplines that are part of the School of Architecture. Her critical scholarship aims to diversify planning history, expose promising replicable grassroots preservation practices, and amplify minority communities' concerns in policy arenas. She's an assistant professor of urban planning and a faculty fellow with the Center for Heritage Conservation in the Institute for Sustainable Communities at Texas A&M University. And before that, she was an emerging scholar fellow at the University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture. That's also where she earned her Ph.D. in community and regional planning. So in addition to that Ph.D., she has an M.A. in government administration from the University of Pennsylvania, a B.A. in political science from Vassar, and brings to her research and writing more than a decade of experience in community and economic development, public management, and planning, right? So she's bringing together the academic and the practice really well. I first came into contact with Andrea Roberts' work when I read her really important online piece for the National Trust on intersectional preservation practice, thinking about how can we think about justice in relationship to preservation. And she makes a whole bunch of really important points, but I wanted to reiterate a couple of those points because I think they're really central in her work and should be central to all of our work. One of those is embrace the non-experts. Right? Don't just listen to the people who are traditionally preservationists or the people who are traditionally planners, right? We need to expand our definition. She's talking here about historic preservation, but I think we need to do that same kind of expanse, whether we're looking at architecture, at planning, at landscape architecture. Who is an expert is not just the credentialed people who've gone on a really traditional path. And connected to that, listen to women of color and to others living at intersections in order to gain an understanding of intersectional oppression, right? If we want to understand how systems of inequality work, we need to pay attention and really listen to the people who are the most directly affected and listen to them talking about how it's never just one system. Right, it's always the systems coming together. So in addition to this, as I said, really important work that I think has been circulating quite a bit, she's also published on Black women's placemaking in the Journal of Planning History and the role of storytelling among grassroots preservationists for the Journal of Community Archaeology and Heritage. And she's also really importantly founder of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, which is a research and social justice initiative documenting African Americans' placemaking history and contemporary planning practices and challenges. So today, we're very, very happy to have her here to talk on curating freedom, making hidden Black publics visible with descendant communities. So join me in welcoming Dr. Andrea Roberts.
I don't know who that was. They sound impressive. How is everyone this evening? Good, I hope. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the generous introduction and welcome. I'm so pleased to be here and be hosted by the school and also by the center. And I'm just excited to visit with you this evening. But before I get into this whole curating of freedom thing, I want to talk to you about a particular space associated with freedom in Texas. And it's not just a space, it's actually a tree. And it's called a freedom tree. And it's specifically located in Missouri City, Texas. Missouri City, Texas is suburban Houston, essentially. And this marker next to this grand tree is telling the story of the Palmer Plantation. Palmer was one of the original 300 settlers of Texas, and when he died, he willed his plantation to his daughter. And what this tree is supposed to capture and symbolize is the space at which African Americans learned that they became free at the event that we call Juneteenth. How many of you are familiar with Juneteenth? Okay, great. So many people are like, what is that? Juneteenth, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, Texas had a delayed notification about freedom. And as a result, we learned in June 19th, 1865. And in this area, we learned underneath that tree that we were free. And so what's interesting about this marker is it tells that story, but it tells it in such a way that it decenters those being freed. And let me tell you how I know that, or how I make that observation. At the end of that marker, it says, "It was in this light that slavery ended on the Palmer land beneath the spreading boughs of the freedom tree, and may it stand ever proudly a symbol of our freedoms as Americans." So that was curious to me. And then I went with my friend Ayana and her son Zahir. As any boy next to a tree would just start climbing it, right? He just start wanting to climb it. And we had to explain to him, hey, it looks like a strong tree. It looks, like something you can just have your way with, but you can't. Because up here, you can certainly see, at least I hope you can, all those tension lightning rods, right? They're very taut and tight that keep this tree together. And you can't see those. And the story, it centers this white benevolence, like, I have released you and you're free. And it's very hard to see the truth, the essence of what's happening, what really happened beneath that tree, and the history that led up to the so-called freedom that they learned about at the tree. And so I want to illuminate that hole, that missing space, that null value of the critical enslaved voice, the critical recently free voice in my presentation. And so this talk is principally about curating placemaking as freedom-seeking behavior, right? And this is a absence, or what Jacob Gobery refers to as the null value. And in digital humanities scholar and historian Jessica Marie Johnson posits that this null value is actually fugitivity, Black agency, that is missing from so much of our understandings of why the landscapes are the way they are. We see the production, but we don't see the escape, the fugitivity related to our landscapes. And so I look also to the work of people in Black geography who are all trying to do what McKittrick says, which is render these places geographic, these seemingly ungeographic, invisible, null, purposefully disremembered landscapes of Black agency, and make them visible again by emphasizing, seeking, and looking for those aspects of the landscape that are freedom-seeking. And I use that phrase, freedom-seeking, associated with Neil Roberts, who talks about freedom as marronage, marronage being, again, fugitivity. So these are the ideas I'm working with today as I talk about freedom colonies. And as you mentioned, a lot of my work right now is very digital, very online, but I will be very analog in my presentation today in that I'm emphasizing the reason for a mapping tool, a space to curate this freedom and where it comes from. So I then ask in this today, how do we interrupt our collusion with a persistent narrative of disremembering the uncomfortable, disremembering the null value? How do we do that? And so the important thing I want to first do is contextualize freedom colonies, these historic Black settlements founded in Texas. They don't pop out of the ether. They don't come out of nowhere, right? They come out of a story. And so what we are doing today in this contemplation, what I do in most of my work, is try to create these social curation workspaces where we are all together coming to understand the nature of these hidden Black publics, particularly freedom colonies in this instance. So to situate freedom colonies within our other understandings of free Black spaces, this is a very informal continuum in which there's not a sort of absolute barrier, but generally speaking, we can look to pre-emancipation communities in which African Americans seized spaces on the edge of plantations and developed maroon communities in which they created free spaces or were manumitted. And then we have, of course, which you Virginians are very familiar with, the contraband camps. At Roanoke Island, the American Missionary Association, which went on to found several HBCUs, developed a planned community there for freedmen. And this was also a space at which freedmen were expelled and lost any assets they accumulated there. And then we move into freedmen's towns. Freedmen's towns is associated with the first wave of Reconstruction. And some Texas freedom colonies would fall into that period of time associated with Reconstruction through about 1877. And we have another wave of founding of settlements in Texas during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. We would call these freedom colonies as well. There's a larger Black settlements and towns movement with towns that a lot of us are familiar with hearing about, such as Rosewood, Florida, Eatonville, Florida, the home of Zora Neale Hurston, Allensworth, California, Nicodemus, Kansas, Mountain Bayou, Mississippi, and the list goes on. And then we can look at pre-World War II to World War II Black neighborhoods, which is more commonly the geography that we ascribe to spaces in which most African Americans live. So when I talk about freedom colonies, this work also is somewhat based on the work of Thad Sitton and James Conrad, who have a sort of historiography based on dissertations and theses from various fields on Black settlements, in which you sort of cobble together a beginning history of these places, not contemplating them as present day, but as just historical artifacts of the past, in which he calls them dispersed communities, settlements, places unplatted, unincorporated, and individually unified only by church and school and residents' collective belief that a community existed. Emphasis mine. Residents' collective belief that a community existed. So we have then this explosion of placemaking, but where does it come from? Explosion of Texas Freedom Colony placemaking between 1865 and 1920. But we have to understand the rootedness of this emphasis on property and land as being the bedrock of community in Texas. So of course, we often brag that Texas was a republic before it was part of the Union. And the reason why it had such fast growth initially is because Spanish land grants, for every enslaved person you brought with you, you were afforded another 80 acres. So it's kind of incentivized you bringing some enslaved people with you, right? And you had the Texas Homestead Act. However, even though African Americans had been released by that time, had been emancipated rather, we were not able to take advantage of it because Black codes were passed and we could not accumulate land. We couldn't accumulate publicly available land. And so how would we get this land? Adverse possession, squatting, and sometimes, rarely, outright purchase, and in the instance where people actually recognize their enslaved children and their progeny, they would sometimes leave them land. But what you had that was so amazing was in 1870, African Americans owned 2% of all farmland in Texas. By the time we get to 1910, we own 31% of all farmland in Texas. And these communities, these clusters of landowners who come together out of both safety and a sense of intentional community building, not we were pushed here and we have no choice, but intentional community building, where we built cemeteries, churches, schools, near the railroads, the mills, the bottoms. When we speak of the bottoms, low-lying flood-prone areas to build these communities. So what happened to them is always the grand question, right? Where are they now? So we have a number of factors that contribute to their decline, as we would say. The Great Migration, the threat of violence. And so to be sure, there was a constant threat of violence. But when you accumulated property as an African American, you were also considered a threat because there was a sense of entitlement, especially after the Civil War, where the intention was, yes, we would like you to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but we would not like you to accumulate more capital than we do as whites. So you had this population loss, this seeking of opportunity elsewhere. You had infrastructure projects that ran straight through communities. We can look to, in Houston, Texas, 4th Ward, also known as Freedman's Town, in which I-45 now cuts through it, as well as City Hall. You had then, with the absence of population, of building integrity and demolition by neglect and deferred maintenance and eligibility for the type of financing that would enable these families to address the deferred maintenance. And an overall invisibility and, again, a history of place that is often only in the memory, tied up in intangible heritage, right? So you have a combination of factors here that make them not visible in the public. However, how do we reconcile this incredible imprint on the landscape? So if we look at what is the black imprint on Texas, it is not simply an imprint that is on the major cities, even though we can see the darker green associated with places like Houston and Beaumont and Austin. But throughout the eastern half of the state, we see that there are some 557 Freedom Colony names, place names. That's a large imprint. And the other interesting barrier to us being able to understand this imprint, this black agency in the landscape, is that there's sort of normative planning and preservation ideas, some of which Dr. Sewell referred to. These are certain ideas we have about the relationship between our fields and the African American community. I'm sure this doesn't refer to anybody here, but this is common. That all African Americans are to be understood as living and organized around blocks and corridors in urban areas. That when we talk about historic African American places, that we can address whatever is wrong with them by engaging in symbolic memorialization, and that's it. That the aesthetics of African American spaces, lovingly referred to, and appropriately so as vernacular in many instances, is not an aesthetic that measures up to the standards. When I say standards, I'm talking about the National Register of Historic Places, National Historic Preservation Act, Secretary of the Interior standards, which create a sort of preservation apartheid, in which African American spaces, by virtue of their conditions, are disproportionately excluded from being eligible for recognitions. And sort of one size fits all. What's the solution? What's the best practice? What's the demonstration site? That will give me the answer. So freedom colonies are a little more complicated. And I gave you that big 557 number, and then I want to take you down to a much smaller scale. So you can understand how I encountered and come to understand these places on a regional scale, and then work back out from there. So the space in which I work, the Deep East Texas Freedom Colonies specifically, I want to talk briefly about the context and the demography of these places, because I find them intriguing, and I think you Virginians will too, because some of the people that lived in this area, some of the earliest known settlers in this area, were actually referred to as Redbones or Melungeons. How many have heard Melungeons before, right? Especially timely right now, because the Melungeons tie their particular lineage back to the original Africans that came in 1619 from the, and these migrants came from the Tidewater states, right? And this is written about, interestingly enough, by Frederick Law Olmsted in A Journey Through Texas, or A Saddle Trip on the Southwestern Frontier, in which he talks about what life was like in this area, which was actually referred to as the neutral strip. That is, the area I'm referring to is this sort of border between Louisiana and Texas. This was an area of chaos for a very long time. So in 1857, he writes, "This county has been lately the scene of events which prove that it must have contained a much larger number of free Negroes and persons of mixed blood than we were informed on the spot. In spite of the very severe statute forbidding their introduction, they banded together. They have been able to resist the power, not only of the legal authorities, but of local vigilance committees on the banks of the Sabine River." So we have here an encounter with this chaotic mixed race area as sort of what he saw as an anomaly in Texas. And so when I came to the area, I was very interested in learning not only about whatever happened to those Melungeons who often passed for white and moved to Texas in the 1820s, which seemed really counterintuitive until you understand the chaotic place that Texas was, in which the Mexican government, once it took over, was very open to African Americans coming and settling, but then you had the Texians, who we associate with freedom and liberty, who were actually interested in perpetuating slavery. What a contradiction, what a chaotic place. But this is also a space in which I encountered a community known as Shankleville Community in Newton County, about 15 miles from the Louisiana border and the Sabine River. And what's notable about this particular community is the role of storytelling in this community as not just a pastime or entertainment. And so the first time I came to the community, before I got acquainted with their exciting foundational origin story, I went to their Purple Hull Pea Festival. Who's had a Purple Hull Pea? Somebody's had one. Okay, good. Also known as a cow pea, also, akin to the black-eyed pea, okay? And so this was a core crop, So the community there in 2014 started a food waste festival. And someone told me, you should go check out this community. You're interested in this stuff. You need a case study. Why don't you go check it out? So go check it out meant 5 hours in my car on the way to Shankleville. And this young lady, yes, I'm from Texas, but Shankleville was a trip behind what we call the Pine Curtain. It's really not where you want to go. That's what you're told. You don't want to go behind the Pine Curtain because it's filled with pine trees and remote rural areas. But I did, and when the festival wasn't there, I noted the next day that this was their new community core, and that they had very few full-time residents, that you had the church, you had a marker, and you had a homestead that was on the National Register of Historic Places, which was really unique and interesting, and this pathway that they said led to VSpring is how they referred to it. So what is at VSpring? Let's see if I can do this.
Okay. It is here that, as the story is told, Winnie Shankle, who was herself a slave, used to come to this point, and runaway slave Jim Shankle would meet her here. She would feed him every day until such time as her owner decided out of the grace of his heart to purchase Jim Shankle. And this is where the story began.
So this is one of the many ways that I've heard this story told about two enslaved Africans in Mississippi, one of which is sold away to a master in Texas, and Jim Shankle runs after her the fugitive enslaved man decides to cross 3 great rivers for his love, Winnie, where he finds her right here at this spring. So it sounds like a lovely and fantastical story, except it has real life impact on this community. Not only is it the story that they love to tell, but the occasions in which they tell it, the way they tell it, and the way they deploy that story to achieve their planning and preservation goals was notable to me and significant. It was significant because they created what Patricia McCutcheon, who writes in Black geographies, calls a Black counterpublic space, a distinct space in which they took control of their own narrative, okay? And they did this in a number of different ways. This is one of the descendants of Jim Shankle. He's a keeper of the spring. And what he does is he teaches younger children to retell the story, and they drink from the spring and have something much like an African libation ceremony, though they wouldn't call it that. But they have it every 2 years. He's the keeper of the spring and of the homestead, a rehabilitation of the homestead. And so we have this fugitive-centered slave narrative that they reenact and retell in so many different ways. As I mentioned, they've preserved their homestead, and they actually, when I say they've preserved it, they have hired a rehabilitation architect to tell them what to do. And every other weekend, the descendants go and rehabilitate the homestead. So they're rebuilding everything and putting things together using the Secretary of Interior standards. They are at it as we speak. And what we see here is at their annual events where they reenact and retell the story, at their annual homecomings. Who's been to a homecoming? And I don't mean a homecoming at a football game. So a homecoming is a community celebration. And it's a celebration in which people return from all over to a community which they, by way of a church or a blood kinship or social kinship, call home. And so these are times and spaces, these sprung up a lot of the 30s and the 40s because why? Well, the Great Migration. So you had to have a way, this was an instrument, a way of getting the diaspora to return and remain committed to these spaces. And they do to this day. So each one of those representatives are from a local freedom colony around Shankleville. So they have a cooperative agreement that they've had for over 76 years where they each hold these homecomings and they take up an offering, and the offering funds cemetery preservation. And so there are individuals who may live in Houston, Dallas, California, wherever. They're going to come back here and get buried. This is where they return. This is their true home. Even if they may have never lived there full time in their lives, but their parents or grandparents did, they come back here. And so I thought to myself, this is incredible. How true is this elsewhere? How true is this in other settlements in the same area? And what is the actual relationship between the settlements? And so the next time that they planned a festival, I became one of the co-planners at the table of their symposium. They have sort of a history symposium on freedom colonies they started. So after months of co-planning the event, I helped to develop a testimony service. And in the Black church tradition, when we talk about a testimony, we talk about how far we've come, what we have to be grateful for, some of you may call them your concerns, right? So this was a space in which these individuals from different freedom colonies, from actually all over the state, told their foundational stories, but how they use those foundational stories, that is, how they use them to mobilize descendants to come back, how they reproduce the culture and the identity associated with those stories. And so this became also an event in which I met more descendants from other freedom colonies. But what was notable about this event is you had people talking about sort of their best practices, and we had funders there, and we had Texas Historical Commission there to make available information. So we had this reciprocity, not just give me your stories, but here are also some resources. And so then I decided to take the show on the road, so to speak, and meet people where they are and engage in co-curation. Why is it co-curation? Because I would not have been able to find any of these people if I didn't spend a lot of time with descendants who would say to me, you can catch Mr. Johnson, but he fish fries on that day in his garage, so you need to get to the fish fry if you want to record him. And so there I am, waiting on the fish. And so he is regaling me with stories of his particular settlement in Jasper County, Texas. And so this was one of the many ways in which I was able to learn about these communities. More specifically, I engaged in Descendant-led walking tours, archive preservation and analysis. That is, baby, here's this folder of stuff, you want to take it? No, ma'am, I will scan it for you, and then I'll give the copy of the USB to your granddaughter, and that way you'll know you have it, and I will not take your things. So there's those conversations, right? Recording memories and stories, either in groups or while at reunions or any of these events, and then doing co-survey. That is, I would have people distribute the survey on my behalf, or introduce me at a homecoming, say, this young lady's going to come talk to all of y'all, those kind of introductions. And the walking tours and being hosted, just staying in people's homes, everything from a man who had a 340-acre ranch that was left to him by the person who enslaved his ancestors, to a very modest home. So what I found in the course of doing this work, however, were these narratives that were hidden, these narratives of agency. So the very opposite of agency that we think of when we see these images, I guess it would be on your right, was the instance that we know as the dragging death of James Byrd, which occurred in Jasper County. And many people believe it happened in the city of Jasper. So most of my research took place in Newton and Jasper County, which are adjacent to one another. But what's significant here is that he was dragged actually down a road called Huff Creek Road, which was not just a road, but it was a settlement. It was a freedom colony. And he was dragged to the foot of that exact sign where it says Huff Creek Memorial Chapel. That's where pieces of his body were found. So when walking here, however, that's not the story that people told me. They told me that story, but the core story was this was a freedom colony. This was a way station, kind of in-between point between the two settlements. That chapel used to be a Rosenwald school. This was the story of hidden placemaking and agency that wasn't coexisting with the dominant story. And then I went to Dixie community, which had the most binary, dichotomous story that I can think of. Yet Joshua Sewell, who was a slave owner, owned hundreds of slaves in Jasper County. And what's notable is that he had one enslaved person named that people called Uncle Dick Sewell. And he's said to have built the oldest church that side of the Mississippi while still enslaved in 1850. And the great-great-great-grandson of Joshua Sewell, the slave owner, was actually a White House historian. And he told the story of Joshua Sewell in such a way, or rather of Dick Sewell in such a way that he was a favored slave in the household and he was just like family. And notably, this is the dominant narrative about this particular area. No one knows that it's called Dixie community in the public history, that it was an actual settlement and not just a church. And fewer know that the descendant of Dick Sewell is Bobby Sewell, who writes about, yes, he grew up in California, but he spent his summers in Jasper County in Texas. He loves barbecuing now and talks about food because he learned how to do it in Jasper County. So we have the extreme opposite. And so you have the descendants here, one of which is Bobby Joe, the late, unfortunately, Bobby Joe Hadnot, there on the far right, who is his descendant. They share the same great-great-grandfather. And Bobby Sewell, in his own writing, talks about food, but what they also have here is a coming back of gentlemen from Houston. All of these gentlemen grew up going to the school. They live in Houston. They've come back. They've reclaimed the building, reclaimed the space, and decided that this is not just going to be about preserving the school, but making a new community center. and a new space for their organization, which is called the Community and Family Historical Preservation Association. And so these are living narratives about these places, right? It's not just about the original or the origin. And part of that living is the way that the settlements are actually connecting with one another. You have an archaeological dig at the spring in Shankleville going on. And so who's involved in that? Children. Where are the children coming from? Dixie community. So they have an exchange now, of an intergenerational and an exchange between settlements. Here they are learning how you make sausage. I saved you from a lot of the other pictures because I know not everyone's comfortable with watching hog killing, but that's what they learned because that was the way that you sustained yourself in a freedom colony. So they're passing these things on. So I noted all types of activities, right? I talked about different places, but what's important to see here is there's a list of about 14 settlements right there where it says pre-study at the top. And those are the settlements that I knew of, that I thought existed before I engaged in the tours, the walking tours and the interviews and all the research. And then the blue column and the yellow columns, those are all the settlements that I learned about through the archives and the walking tours and all of that activity. And so we see here that there's a whole other world of the Black imprint on an area that we associate with Black oppression. And so that basis, that is what informs what was mentioned earlier, which is the Atlas, the Texas Freedom Colony Atlas. And so it's an effort to collect and spatialize these place counter narratives. Now, is every narrative that tells the truth about a place romantic, exciting, tragic? Not always. Sometimes they're just tales of land accumulation. But what we've found so far, we have been able to map, that is, find a dot associated with an anchor site or building or land feature that is associated with the settlement. We've done that 357 times out of the 557. So we're auditing the existing list and adding to the list and finding new freedom colonies because we're crowdsourcing. And also adding surveys and photos and trying to use it as an outreach or community archive tool. And I'll be talking about this a lot more tomorrow. But I want to give you I want to end with this sort of on-the-ground example of what it is to use this tool, not only as a way for people to organize their own communities around archiving and making their place visible, but how is it used as a social curation workspace that interrupts business as usual? So an example of that would be work that I did in a place called Gonzales. This is the come and take it canon. In Texas, this is romanticized as an example in which people say, well, we in Texas, you're not going to take our canon. Sure, you may have given it to us in the first place, but that's beside the point. We're not going to let you take it. And this is also a bigger proxy argument for, remember, Texians, as they were called, not wanting to give up the institution of slavery. And we also have something that I know you all are familiar with here, which is a Confederate monument, which is in the middle of the town square. Interesting space to talk about freedom colonies, right? And so I was invited there to give a workshop with the County Historical Commission. I was invited on behalf of Texas Historical Commission and the Gonzales County Historical Commission because they wanted to center freedom colonies. And so the way that they did that is they actually put an event together at a historic church, Providence Missionary Baptist Church, in a freedom colony in Gonzales. And I engaged in the same storytelling activity, but rather than only having freedom colony and people from freedom colonies share the stories, we had everyone there share their stories, right? And in a specific way. So they did these self-assessments, they did all these things, but they also did the storytelling exercise. And the purpose of the overall workshop was to deal with the fact that more than 47% of County Historical Commission boards said that they were perplexed and didn't know how to diversify their programming and their leadership. So that was the reason for doing this. And it was a center a certified local government training. And so here's the exercise. I'm going to play this for you. And the story of Texas. Did you make any connections? I mean, you're from Gonzales and Curating, but how did you see your home place story as the story of Texas? What was the relationship? Yes, ma'am.
I grew up on a 2,000-acre original land grant from the Republic of Texas to a great-great-grandfather for his service during the Indian Wars. If they couldn't pay him, so they gave him a 1,000-acre land grant.
Whose day? I'm sorry, I just want to make
The
sure.
Republic of Texas, before it was a state, it was its own republic. So the government gave that land to its third or fourth grandfather. And he actually went to Austin and helped form the first legislature and everything for the government of Texas. So, it's woven throughout my family on both sides. But it doesn't give him, if you're going back clear to the Republic of Texas before it was even a state. Long history.
I identify with that a lot. I don't tell you why. So, is anybody familiar with the old 300s? Yes? So, I have an ancestor named Julia. My ancestor Julia was born in Sumter, Tennessee in 1821. And she was eventually sold to the Kirkendalls. And specifically Joseph Kirkendall in Fort Bend County. And so I've been here since then, too. And so when I think about the story of Texas, I very much think about the Republic of Texas. And I very much think about those land grants. And I very much think about how much land they were afforded by virtue of bringing Julia here. And so when we think about these stories, they're multi-dimensional stories. Are they not? It's not one story at all, is it? And so that's what I want us to think about today. And so that's what I want us to think about today. These multi-dimensional stories. And rather than leaving you with a neat conclusion, I'm going to be cantankerous and disobedient and leave you with more questions. But I think that they should also capture what it is that I hope to be doing with these encounters with story and leveraging of these social curation workspaces. How do practitioners and educators re-envision planning and preservation as freedom-seeking? Not just control of space and placement of people in space, but as freedom-seeking. How do we continue to center the analog and not just the digital, even when it requires confrontation and discomfort? And how will you make room for counter and multivocal public places, even when it means subordinating your own expertise? And how can we detect, yet not exploit the null, the fugitive, and resistant in our landscapes, our classrooms, and our leadership circles? And with that, I thank you, and Julia thanks you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Way back in the back here, sorry. All the way at the peanut gallery, sorry.
Okay.
So in that rich tapestry, have you been engaged with any Native American communities?
I actually have, and I was at the last event that I showed you, the Gonzales County event. The first storyteller was actually a Native American woman who's also the chair of the County Historical Commission in Austin. And so the intersection of Native American stories and African American stories is an area of inquiry that I'm very interested in pursuing. I don't feel comfortable making any conclusions about yet, but that is an area that I want to pursue.
I have a question about the map that you showed that used a red dot to identify the different freedom colonies. And I can understand those dots as a sort of geographical and symbolic sort of heart of these communities. But I'm wondering if you, in your discussion with all the people who lived in them and visited them, got a sense for what the geographical spread was. I mean, was there a kind of geographical boundary that you could understand for the different landscapes? And I'm just sort of trying to imagine what it would,
Certainly.
what the map would look like
Yes.
if it showed the full geography of each of the communities and how fluid or vibrating those edges might have been over time.
So that exact line of inquiry is one of the reasons that we're populating it first with the dots, and then the next step is then to dive into communities to answer that exact question. But what I can tell you is that most of the borders were associated with natural features such as a spring or a river. And the bad part was they lived near low-lying areas, and the good part was they lived near water because they had to be fully self-sustaining. So as far as saying, oh, well, you know you're in a freedom colony because, and it begins here and ends there, those are the exact kind of assumptions we have about place, the way we understand place, that makes these places invisible, because they're not all the same. They don't all have that same kind of sense of boundary or where they begin and end. And that is one of the things that we are also trying to figure out. It's first, find them all, and then we also crowdsource and find ones we didn't know about, and then we dive in deeper. So that's the next layer. But the homestead, the landscape of the homestead, the house, the outbuildings, closeness to water, clusters of those homesteads are actually often a good proxy for understanding the boundaries of the place.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting material. You talked about the disconnect between the National Register and these dispersed vernacular communities. And I wonder if you have had any experience or any success with evaluating them and identifying them as traditional cultural properties. In my experience, that's been very difficult with the National Register if it's not a Native American or sacred site.
Right. The only example that I know of that has actually happened is associated with the Gullah people and the basket weaving. Nicodemus? Okay. I wasn't aware of that. I thought it was a cultural landscape. But yes. Yes. It is a very good tool if you have a state that's interested in exploring that, then it is. I'll leave it at that.
Thinking of, this is maybe a way, way down the line idea in terms of the mapping. I was also really struck by the question of the ways in which each community has the diaspora and then the coming back, and was thinking, you know, what happens if you start mapping the diaspora, right? Where are the people in each of that are connected to each of these places? Where have they gone out to and come back to? Have you started doing that at all, or thought about that?
I have. So what I did during my research is I did begin to do those little matrices of networks and relationships. So I did sketch out a few of those. And then I began to see that people were clustered in particular areas in state, which is what I could readily get to. So I spent a lot of time. It was convenient because I grew up near Houston. There were people in Houston, there were people in Dallas. And so I could really see that diaspora, and much of my research in the book that I'm working on is about the diaspora of people who live in all those major cities and are mostly baby boomers who call these places home and who are the most committed to their preservation. The next scale, yes, a little down the road, I wish it was right now, actually, where I would be exploring this sort of Texas-California migration in the late 40s and 50s. That is what I'm interested in, because there's a cultural and political exchange between Texas and California. And so much of that, especially with music, is the sort of sonic landscape between the two is, I want to do that. Yes.
Okay, I'll pass it in a second. I want to also be disobedient, and will you go back to some of those amazing questions that you just like dropped, and then I would love to hear any thoughts you have. The one that stands out as something that I bet you have some thoughts on, even in a moment where you don't want to answer everything, is how do you make room for counter and multivocal publics?
Yes.
If you're willing to
Yeah.
give us a glimpse into your thinking on that, that'd be awesome.
So what I was doing in showing you the clash of titans that was that interaction, I'm only kidding, at the certified local government training is what I'm hoping to reproduce on a larger scale. We have over 180 county historical commissions in Texas. And so I'm very interested in, quote unquote, taking this on the road and doing more of these trainings. Certified local governments have access to a certain pool of funding that enables them to do surveying and those sorts of things. It comes down through the federal government to the state. And to qualify, they need to go to trainings. There's a certain number that they have to go to. And so wouldn't it be nice for this to be mandatory? And so as much as we would like people out of the goodness of their heart and free will, I think it's going to have to take some level of enforcement to encourage people to get in a situation in which they have to confront, maybe it's not their individual, but their shared uncomfortable situations. So that's one. Yes.
So I think I'm also very interested in that issue. I'm working in Buckingham, which is a county right next to this, and it's such a different situation there, very rural, and former plantation owners are living alongside. So it looks very similar, the descendants of the freedmen. And so there's a silencing of most of the stories that you talked about, even the origin and their schisms and so forth. But the biggest problem lies in people's sense in which they can't speak about it. It's really dangerous. It's still kind of dangerous in that county. And I'm just reporting that I'm an anthropologist. I'm not speaking for people. I'm sort of just trying to bring up things that have come up. And I just was wondering if and we have projects planned for all the homecomings this summer. It starts in April, goes through October. So that's pretty exciting. So I'm just looking for any kind of...
So I don't know your positionality in the interaction with them. Could you help me understand?
Yeah, I'm a longtime resident of Buckingham, and they know me, and yet I'm also an anthropologist.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you know of what their practices are, how they share story?
I do, but it's there's a lot of depth. So they have this, there's a keeper of the story, and there's a lot of people who have died who are the keepers of the stories of each of these families. And so they'll say, oh, if only you had asked me last year before Mr. Patterson died, or, something like that. But I still am hoping that when people come, and again, the question of the matrix of moving, so lots to New Jersey, lots to Brooklyn.
I engage in a lot of the survey. I was introduced one year. The next year, I was distributing the survey, and I was having lunch, and I was doing the survey. And how do I do the survey during lunch? We're having a conversation, and I'm asking you the questions, and we're enjoying brisket, and that's how I'm doing the survey. And I have a recorder, and I have a recorder. I'm totally transparent. So, because some people are not interested in you coming to them with a clipboard or the computer. So it may be, I know you're an expert, you're an ethnographer. I'm just saying that I found.
Food is important. It's always, we get over food.
Yeah, and so sometimes it's that, and then there's also just these other ways that people are collecting the stories. If they have baggies full of homecoming programs, those homecoming programs sometimes have the story, they have other settlements, other communities. it would be a good resource as well. So there are sometimes some written resources. So those are two things.
This is a question about respect of place. And there are two related little stories here. One is that we are the home birth state of Edna Lewis.
Yes.
And she is from a small settlement, Freetown, in Orange County, that unless, I hope someone here has been there, it's impossible to find. I've looked for it. But they may not want me to find it anyway, but which gets to my second question.
Sure.
And that is, my home state of Alabama, we have a famous group of quilters at Gee's Bend. And it almost ruined that community once people found Gee's Bend.
Right.
So so the question in both of those is the respect of place in people's home.
Absolutely. So as soon as I got some traction making the map, I also thought, oh God, what have I done? Right? Because there are always people who are going to manipulate that information for development speculation, whatever. But they're going to do that anyway, right? They being developers, builders. And what I have found recently is I sort of outweighed that fear about who's going to, go in and turn these into tourist traps, What outweighs it is when I hear someone from a cultural resource survey organization call me and say, we are using your map as part of our desk audit on parcels before people are doing projects. They're doing infrastructure projects or looking at floodways. We're using your map so that when we sit down with people, we say, oh, by the way, you need to be on the lookout for the possibility of cemeteries or other resources. And when I heard that, I said, oh, well, that's the whole point of it. It's not the whole point, but in terms of the policy arena, it's the point. And so that's the intervention in the policy arena I hope to make, is that it's integrated into Section 106, 101, 4F reviews, so that we can stop people from building on top of cemeteries or tearing down homes or takings, with just another flag of awareness that's obvious to all the parties involved. So that's what I have.
My question was, how did these communities socially organize themselves? I know they were small, so they probably didn't have necessarily like full-blown governments, or like local governments, but how did they socially organize themselves?
So there were proxy governments that are associated with the institutions. So I'll go through each institution. For example, if we look at a cemetery, there were what were called mutual aid societies, and they operated on multiple scales. So you may have one cemetery in a mutual aid society that is responsible for the care and for distributing insurance policies and having members in a particular community where the cemetery is. And that mutual aid society is then part of a larger network operating across the states in actual, sometimes 3 different states. So you had these organizations that served as proxies for how to operate, what kind of principles you should have, what values you should have. For example, one mutual aid society, their principle was no credit. Don't buy anything on credit. Don't get trapped in the sharecropper system. And here are some ways that you can make sure you budget so that you could. So there were these ways of principles of the social contract of the place embedded in these informal organizations. And if it was the church, it was the deacon board and the ministers. And if it was the school, then you had trustees of these Rosenwald and pre-integration schools that wielded a sort of influence and power akin to governance.
I hope it's on. Is it on?
I think so.
It's on. You're talking about bottomland. I think of floodplain. I think of Superfund sites. And I wonder what efforts have been made that you know of to get federal funding or state funding for communities located in those areas.
One of the conversations that I've been having very publicly and with people in various public agencies is around the fact that 44% of the counties impacted during Hurricane Harvey contained freedom colonies. And that there is not a distinct targeted outreach to some of these remote areas that were disproportionately impacted. And so you have an overall issue with hurricane recovery monies getting to the state. And then you have an overall sort of history of the way it's been distributed that's been problematic in many ways, especially around affordable housing access, et cetera. And then you have this other layer of freedom colonies. So I can say at the very least that I'm in the conversation. The grant applications are highlighting this fact as we talk about different dimensions of vulnerability of the places and their remaining resources.
Dr. Roberts, can you talk about trust and trust building and I think the very unique access that you may have?
Yes.
Because I guess I'm just wondering. I mean, are you in the field alone? Are you part of a team? Is your team integrated? How trust level varies based on who's actually doing the work?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So there are some instances in which the fact that I'm a Black woman descended from people in freedom colonies and have some, knowledge of what these geographies are like. Mind you, I didn't really call them or know them as freedom colonies till I was much older, but I have the familiarity and I have a positionality that reflects that, right? But there are other circles where the trust is not there because I'm associated with a PWI, a predominantly white institution with a certain history. And I'm one of those people, I'm educated, I have a Ph.D, and, where my allegiances lie or not, always they're suspect. So, yes, it helps, that I have this familiarity, but in many instances, because of my association with the community, the trust building is taking a long time. There's a historic Black Towns and Settlements Association that held a summit a couple of weeks ago, and they invited me to be a speaker, even though it was for HBCUs and historic Black Towns and Settlements. So it's their idea of inclusion, and it's been a back and forth with this particular group for a while of where they want their Black agency and they don't want anything sullying it, right? So that's been a process. And no, I don't have this huge elaborate team yet that's diverse. I do have some working with me to develop the mapping, some diverse individuals working on the mapping tool, but the field work has yet to begin with masses of other people.